Hi, welcome back to the Deepfake Dialogues. Today I'm joined by Erin Dumbacher, the Stanton Nuclear Security Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. We're discussing her recent Foreign Affairs article, How Deepfakes Could Lead to Doomsday, in which she argues that AI-generated disinformation poses a direct threat to nuclear early warning systems. Let's dive right in. Hi, Ms. Dumbacher. Thank you for joining me today. So you open your article with Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer who in 1983 was staring at a screen telling him that American nukes were incoming, and he didn't believe it. So what happened that night, and why is this the lens through which we should understand the deepfake threat today?
Stanislav Petrov was a Soviet officer. His job was to make sure that the Americans were not launching a first strike at the Soviet Union. And if they were, to report it up the chain so that the Soviets could counter with their own nuclear forces. That could have been intercontinental ballistic missiles to strike back at the United States. It could have been a submarine-launched ballistic missile to strike at the United States. And what he was doing was part of something we call, and we have in the United States as well, called the early warning system, which is this complex web of multi-aged spy satellites, radar, all kinds of information and intelligence collection that the U.S. government and the Soviet government at the time have on hand to make sure that their main opponent is not launching an offensive first nuclear strike attack at one another, right? And so his job, Stanislav Petrov's job, was to look at a computer monitor and identify if he saw incoming, or if his subordinates saw incoming, those initial missiles from the United States towards the Soviet Union. He got an indication on his computer that said incoming attack. And he took a pause and, using all of what he knew about U.S. strategic strategy and what U.S. missiles tended to look like, and most relevantly to our conversation about AI and deepfakes, he took a second look at what his computer was telling him and tried to understand whether or not it was legitimate, whether or not the computer was being so-called spoofed in some way or confused in some way and was giving him a false alert, or whether or not it was a real attack and he needed to do something about that. And so what's so remarkable about his story is that he took that pause and he said, I don't think my computer is right. I don't think the indication on my computer is legitimate. Therefore, I'm going to take a different course of action than he would have, and then frankly what he had been trained to do anytime there was notification of a potential incoming attack. And so thinking about today and thinking about our reliance, broadly speaking, you and I in our everyday, but also of course those whose job it is to be looking at these computers and these consoles in the US military and militaries all around the world, thinking about our lives and how much we do or do not trust what we see pop up on our computer screen or our phone screen or what have you, even my watch, the extent to which we trust that information, I think, is increasingly a question. In the historical sort of Cold War period, when computers were a little bit earlier in their development, they were a little bit more input one leads to output two, kind of a little bit more rote. It was arguably a lot easier for military officials, but also you and I in our daily lives to understand whether or not we could trust when information came across the screen. And so I think when I think about the challenge today of maintaining nuclear stability, one of the things we need to be thinking about is the degree to which we are in positions now to continue to trust the information that we see across our screens that, of course, we use to make decisions about crises and about war.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's a potential nuclear threat detected, whether real or fake, how much time are we actually talking about before someone has to make a decision?
This is debated, and obviously the exact processes are different in each nuclear weapon state, I should say, too. But in the United States, broadly speaking, what we know in the unclassified context is that it takes a few minutes for that first indication perhaps to show up on computers to be verified. We have a practice in the U.S. military of something called dual phenomenology, which means the military has to confirm via two discrete sources of data and information that an incoming attack is in fact incoming. And then the intelligence community and the military would take that information, pass it to their superiors, who then in turn would pass it to what's called the National Command Authority, which in the United States is the president. And under our laws, the president need not seek anyone else's counsel to make a decision about how to act on that nuclear alert. The U.S. military, of course, has spent a lot of time perfecting the information and the options that the president might have available to him when making that decision. But we're talking a matter of minutes from an initial indication on a screen to someone in the White House counseling the president, or someone on a secure phone call counseling the president of what might be happening. And then it's up to the president and the political authorities in the United States to make a decision about what to do.
Yeah, and so you mentioned in the article deepfakes of Zelensky and Putin that spread during the Ukraine war. So can you explain what people thought and how they reacted, and what that moment taught you about how vulnerable we really are?
I think that one of the underappreciated aspects of what AI is doing in the world today is changing our understanding of what information we can trust and what information we cannot trust. And this applies, of course, also to the military domain. So I think AI can pose a fairly insidious and very present today risk to nuclear security. I think AI can make it, as you know very well, much easier to create and spread deepfakes. Those are convincingly altered videos of foreign leaders. That could be a convincingly altered video or image reported to be someone else's missile launch, for example. Or even audio that's used to generate false information about people or different events. So a couple of examples you mentioned. I think a few weeks after the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there was a widely shared deepfake that showed Volodymyr Zelensky telling Ukrainians to set down their weapons, not fight back against the Russians. That was, of course, a deepfake, and that is not at all what Zelensky at that time was sharing with his people and trying to convince his people to do. But all it takes in certain settings is for one or two people to be a little confused, or to pause, or to think twice about the validity of the information that they're seeing, to change the course of action, right? We know that there were very notable battles early in the 2022 full-scale invasion that the Ukrainians were able to, for example, stop the Russians from moving forward and taking one of their most critical air bases. So if there had been a deepfake in the run-up to that told even one commander or one individual whose job it was to defend that airbase, not to defend or at least gave them pause, what else could have happened in the broader course of events. So that's just one example. There's other examples of deepfakes affecting what Vladimir Putin himself desires to share with his people. So there was an interruption on Russian state television that declared a, quote, full-scale mobilization. Well, that was also a deepfake, and that too could have caused effects among average Russian citizens watching the television, thinking very differently about what that invasion of Ukraine really looked like from their perspective. So I think in a more extreme scenario, a deepfake could actually convince a leader in a nuclear weapons state, maybe even that a first strike from an adversary is in fact underway. Maybe that an AI-supported intelligence platform, maybe it raises some sort of false alarm or of a mobilization, or maybe an alarm that or a a single report that could have been verified or unverified, but seeing it on social media of perhaps a radiological release of some sort. We call it sometimes a dirty bomb. Maybe that there was a dirty bomb somewhere, and therefore that the U.S. administration or another administration around the world that does have nuclear weapons should take some sort of action to counter that most recent action. So any number of events, and you could kind of let your creativity run a little bit here. Any number of events could share information in time of crisis, given what our current sort of structures around the use of nuclear weapons look like today. Given that so much of what we do and our policies and practices around nuclear weapons are based on information veracity, you could imagine a whole host of different potential crises spiraling.
Yeah, and so you're not just worried about deepfakes on social media, like fooling people in power, but you're also worried about like AI systems themselves hallucinating threats that don't exist. So help us understand that differentiation.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. There's a difference between what information can most easily be shared through very open, commercially available platforms to the average citizen, some of whom I might add, though, might be scrolling their feeds and are also staffers of important people in positions to make decision authority. So I don't not worry about that piece if there's a whole host of misinformation flying around. But a second item to be concerned about as the Trump administration tries to ramp up what they aim to be an aggressive rollout. This is by their own policy. The AI action plan from the administration calls for aggressive harnessing of AI across national security and specifically at the Department of Defense, what they call the Department of War. And so in December, that department unveiled something called genai.mil. So it's a platform full of AI tools for employees within the Department of Defense or War to use themselves. And so genai.mil potentially really useful for all hosts of activities in the world's largest bureaucracy. That is that department, right? Financial reporting, financial planning, potentially even planning, force development planning issues more generally. But it'll be really crucial, I think, to set up some guardrails and set up some no-go zones, if you will, for where AI does get rolled out across the department. Specifically, we need to be really careful about the role that machines can play in the earliest phases of nuclear decision-making. And I'm not as concerned, frankly, about sometimes what you see in the films of a machine itself ultimately making the decision to deploy a nuclear weapon. U.S. policy, as it was set out in a 2022 document, made it very clear, and we agreed that, and the Chinese actually agreed that they would do the same, which is to make sure that a machine never makes the decision to use a nuclear weapon. I'm more concerned about all of the phases leading up to a decision eventually that could have bearing on whether or not we use conventional munitions somewhere and ultimately potentially even nuclear weapons somewhere. I'm thinking about all of the engineers who for decades have been so diligent in making sure our early warning systems are the very best in the world, that there's never a false or surprise attack, that we really do have true information veracity around what our adversaries are doing in the nuclear space in particular. But if we start to deploy AI in places for the first time without the right guardrails and too far sort of across the spectrum to the point where maybe an operator doesn't have a full understanding, it's kind of a black box scenario of what's really going on under the hood of the machine, if you will, to use a car analogy. If we get to the point where some system could be spoofed or an AI machine could be hallucinating and sending the wrong information. All of that, of course, raises questions about what data AI tools are actually trained from, which data can be sparse and tricky in the nuclear space because thankfully we've only had 2 uses of nuclear weapons in global history. Other nuclear weapon states need to agree, I think, just as the United States and China have now done, that only a human will make the decision to ever use a nuclear weapon. But we also need to be really thoughtful about where we ultimately deploy some of these AI tools. I'll mention too here that I'm thinking about AI as sort of its textbook definition and not in the really expansive way that some people talk about AI, because there's actually already some automation and digital tools and computers being used across U.S. nuclear weapons systems for good reason, right? It can be very difficult to manually track every object in low Earth orbit to make sure that it's not an incoming missile, right? So we need some computers and we need some automation connected to our radars, for example, to make sure that they're working as best as they can. I am all in favor of updating and maintaining those computer systems. I'm not in favor of deploying AI across all of those as sort of a de facto choice.
Yeah, and so you mentioned that any AI trained to detect nuclear attacks would have almost no real data to learn from, since we've only had 2 nuclear attacks in history. And then you also add in the article that people tend to trust AI outputs even when they shouldn't, especially under pressure. So why is this combination so deadly?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I would be curious to hear from some of those who are at the frontier of AI model development, really what they have learned about the ability for us to use some hybrid of advanced, like good, cogent, real data on real life events, plus synthetic data or data that machines themselves create to try to mimic real world events and occasions. I described already kind of the patchwork and the broad system that is U.S. nuclear early warning today. And frankly, you could extend that all the way to like the way the United States intelligence community writ large tries to understand what's going on in the world, right? So there's a whole host of different systems, classified and unclassified, and data sources from all of those systems, classified and unclassified, that a thoughtful U.S. policymaker is trying to gather together and understand from to ultimately make the best decision in the U.S. national interest. And so as I think about these variety of data sources, what I worry about is again a patchwork deployment of AI across them that could touch each of them in different ways and to different degrees. So military operators, when a new technology comes about, there's a broad swath of policies and procedures and practices and training that goes along with every new piece of technology. I worry about us moving so far ahead and so quickly down an AI sort of investment route that we don't necessarily take the time to perfect what does that human and machine team really look like in some of these really high impact, high risk operations and high risk events. And I would put nuclear early warning very much in the category of a high risk category. Now, that's not to say that AI should never touch anything that comes anywhere near the word nuclear in the Department of Defense or War, because I do think that there are some really critical applications for some of our advanced technology. And some, I think, will rightfully make the case that the Chinese and the Russians might be trying to insert AI into some of their systems. And to some degree, we might need to keep up. I think about this especially in a cybersecurity framework of really critical networks. Maybe that is a really important place to think about the right way to inject some of the most advanced AI tools. But I think the technologists are still struggling with how do you combine different types of data sets? How do you combine the real with the synthetic? And how do you actually convey that to an operator in a way that they too, just like Stanislav Petrov did in the 1980s, have enough of a sense for when it's right and when it's wrong?
And so you've acknowledged that the Trump administration has rolled out a plan to use AI in the military in certain contexts. So what is your assessment of how they're doing that. Is there anything that you think should not be done or that's not appropriate right now for AI to be doing? Yeah.
Yeah, I worry about AI-driven misinformation spurring what I'll call cascading crises. So a little bit of information here that then leads to, because of our policies and our procedures and our practices as they stand today, creating a bigger problem, even though it was perhaps just a bit of bad information in one area. So I think about obviously deepfakes that are transmitted via open source media. That would include social media. I think, if we see a deepfake video, what does the intelligence community do when that comes across their screens? What does an intelligence analyst do when they see something that they think could be a U.S. adversary saying something that could trigger a crisis, but they don't necessarily have the technological or they're unsure, let's say. The confidence interval, if you will, is not so clear on whether or not this is a true statement or a false statement. And then what does that intelligence analyst do next? Do they pass it along as truth? Do they pass it along with caveats? Do the caveats at some point get lost in translation? And then I worry, of course, about policy leaders who, especially if there's a time crunch, and if an adversary's nuclear weapon is targeting the United States, the president has the option, need not, but has the option to fire one of our nuclear weapons back at them. If they were to choose to use an intercontinental ballistic missile, that would fire and strike within 30 minutes. And so there's an incoming time crunch if we see something on alert, in some instances, to go ahead and make a quick decision for fear that you might not have all of your own nuclear weapons available, and therefore have the same set of options. So in this already compressed time environment, I worry about a little bit of bad information here or there, and then how that gets transmitted. Now, all that to say, I have a lot of faith in the U.S. intelligence community and all of our national technical means of understanding exactly what our adversaries are doing on a day-to-day basis. I have a lot of faith that we are watching things closely. I have a lot of faith that the way that information is transmitted to policymakers is cogent and sound and thoughtful and appropriately caveated. That's not to say, however, that in time of crisis, again, that these issues will never be an issue. Also, that policymakers, they have the option to not trust their own intelligence communities. And we're seeing, I think, an increase in policymakers not necessarily trusting their own staffs, frankly, and the folks whose job it is to try to get them the best information and the best data. And so I worry that even if we have the best information presented by the smartest, most savvy, and most patriotic individuals, that perhaps they won't always be listened to in time of crisis.
Yeah, and so how realistic so first of all, what are some reforms that you think could be helpful in this new era of synthetic media, deepfakes, AI? And how realistic would it be to enact these reforms?
Yeah, I think implementing AI across military systems does not have to be an all or nothing equation. I think that there are some areas that should just be off limits for AI for now, until we have a better sense for what the technology can and cannot do. Full stop. I think that's the first most obvious. There are just places where for today, for now, given where the models stand here in early 2026, where we should be careful and make sure that we're managing the risks, as I said, of hallucination, of spoofing, and making sure, frankly, that the benefits of applying the new technology actually outweigh the potential risks, or at least that the risks are managed. They might not ever go away entirely, but that we're thinking through the risks and the management of them. The best AI systems are really built on cross-checked and very comprehensive data sets. So figuring out that data question, um, nuclear early warning systems, lack both the ability to use broad swaths of commercial data to help generate the right answer, and they also lack the comprehensiveness, and sort of the veracity that a lot of, let's say, internet-based information and data that has trained a lot of the AI models today can hold. So figuring out that data and that input question, I think, is the next step. It might also be tempting to replace some of the checks that highly professionalized military staff place on AI systems once they are deployed, but to just use other machines or use other AI to do that, to help speed up the analysis, or try to just find economies of scale, even, maybe, I could imagine. But removing really critical human eyes, I think, can lead to errors, it can lead to bias, and it can lead to misunderstandings, given the state of a lot of these models that we have today. So the Department of Defense today requires meaningful human control of autonomous weapon systems. And I think it should require that each element of nuclear early warning and intelligence technology meet an even higher standard than just meaningful human control. And then I also think that AI data integration tools, they shouldn't just replace the human operators who are doing a lot of that today. AI at its best, I think, supports a really talented, professionalized human operator. So finding ways, again, for that human machine teaming to really work together. And then more broadly, perhaps we should be having renewed conversations in this country about the way we set up our internal U.S. nuclear launch authorities and processes in a new age, in a new era, where information that we see sort of at face value can't always be trusted. We already have some procedures that we could build upon, but ultimately the decision in the United States come down to a single person, and that's the U.S. president. And I don't know if every American, when they cast their vote, is thinking top of mind about whether or not the person that they are choosing to elect is also the person that, in this environment, technologically advanced, et cetera, whether or not they are comfortable with that one individual from any party, frankly, but just one individual on their own being able to make the ultimate decision about use of a nuclear weapon.
So to wrap up, so how worried should we be? And despite everything that you've laid out, what gives you hope that we might actually get this right?
Gives me hope is that there are very highly trained, dedicated, patriotic individuals in all nuclear weapons countries, I would argue, but especially in the U.S. military, who are very thoughtful about the important jobs that they have when it comes to defending the United States, using, operating our nuclear deterrence policies, and of course, above all, watching to see what our adversaries are doing to try to make sure that the U.S. policymaker has the best information that they can have in time of crisis to make the best decision for Americans. That gives me a lot of hope. I also think that there was progress made when the Biden administration, when President Joe Biden met with the Chinese president in 2024. They both agreed that the United States and China would only make sure that humans were making the decision to use a nuclear weapon, that task would never be handed over to a machine. So I think that there's hope for all nuclear weapon states to make a similar commitment. That would be low-hanging fruit, I think, in terms of what we could hope for on a global stage. And then I do think we need to be much more thoughtful about how information flows through our not just within our intelligence apparatus here in the United States that supports the nuclear deterrence mission, but also what are we all seeing on our social media feeds? That plays into this too, right? If we see the beginnings of what seems alarming, are we looking at something that is true? Are we looking at something that is making sure that we are getting the right information at the right time. And so I do worry that we are in an environment that is ripe for triggering crises, and to trigger crises that could be cascading, that one thing could lead to another, given the rest of our policies and practices and protocols. I worry that one bit of information could spur a cascading crisis of misunderstanding that in the very worst case could lead to a nuclear disaster, but is much more likely to lead to a whole host of other challenging international relations issues. But again, what gives me hope is that there are very thoughtful engineers, very thoughtful military operators, very thoughtful intelligence analysts who are all trying to do the right job, the best job that they can do, that puts the American citizens' national security interests above all the rest, and that they will be thoughtful about the right places where they can, in fact, find economies of scale for inserting AI systems into their workflows, but also cautious in the places where, frankly, the technology just hasn't advanced enough and the human-machine teaming sort of questions haven't been developed enough to understand whether or not that should trickle all the way into some of our most secure systems.
This is a really insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me, Ms. Dumbacher.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deepfake Dialogues. If you found this conversation insightful, please follow and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out. See you in the next episode.